Welcome to a special series with the Empowered to Connect podcast, where we come together to discuss a healing-centered approach to engagement and well-being for ourselves, our families, and our communities. This is War and Resilience, how Ukrainians are teaching the world. We've got a special 3-episode series here, and we sat down and talked to several individuals about the war in Ukraine, what happened to precipitate it, how Ukrainian culture has become such a resilient people. And then we wanted to take a look at the future of mental health care in Ukraine. So how are we going to care for the babies who are affected by war and the adults who have been stuck in the middle of it? And so we had some fascinating conversations. First up, episode 1 is with Madison and Yuriy Perekotiy, and they are going to talk about how we got here. How did this conflict start? What was happening before? And what was it like having friends and loved ones there when the war broke out? So now, without any further ado, here it is, Madison and Yuriy Perekotiy talking about how we got here in the Ukrainian war. All right, well, we're here, as we talked about in the opening, with Madison and Yuriy Perekotiy, and they are here. They are stateside right now, but we'll get into their story and their connection with the Ukraine soon. Guys, first of all, thanks for making time to be here. And obviously, there is so much happening in the Ukraine. We want to get to that in just a minute. For people who might not be familiar with y'all's story or with kind of where you are in the world, would you mind just kind of sharing a little bit about yourselves and then how you made it, well, Yuriy, for you, back to the Ukraine, or Madison, how you made it to the Ukraine?
Yeah, so I'm Madison. I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. I am the oldest of 10 children in my family, and 7 of my siblings were adopted from Ukraine. So my story with Ukraine started when I was 12, when my parents took me and my 2 biological brothers on the adoption trip to Lviv, and it changed my world. So when the grandparents complain that we're overseas, it's not my fault. You guys took me there and I fell in love with it. And for anybody who's ever been to Eastern Europe, it's not for everyone. So it's definitely part of God's assignment in my life that I love Eastern Europe so much that I went and found a husband from there. And so the short snippets, kind of the little guideposts in my journey, were 12 years old, go to Ukraine for the first time in 2001, went back to serve at some summer camps that were Christian youth camps for Ukrainian teenagers, but they brought teams over, and the draw was that it was an English language camp. So would go on 2-week, 3-week trips, 15, 16, 17, 18 years old, and served a whole summer the year after my freshman year in college. And Yuriy and I actually met at the Passion conferences in 2008. 2008. They did a world tour. The first stop was Kyiv. My dad and I went because we knew the people that were helping, to make the connections, host and translate everything. And he was in a group that was sponsored by a ministry we were connected with. And so that's how we met.
Okay, that's awesome. And Yuriy, you are from Ukraine originally.
Yeah, I was born 10 days after Chernobyl, and on the eastern part of Ukraine. When I met Madison in 2008, my English was not existing at all.
Okay, hold on. Genuinely.
Genuinely.
No, I knew maybe like 20 words. That was it.
Yeah.
Okay, your English is unbelievable for it to be that young.
Yeah. I know. So when we met, English was non-existent for him. And I would say 2 notches above good tourist Russian. So he comes from a Russian speaking area. Okay. And Ukrainian is the national language of Ukraine, but there's a lot of areas where Russian is the native language because of the post-Soviet Union. Yeah. So I knew enough Russian to more than get around by myself. And so that's how it started. It's a miracle we're still together.
And the 2 guys who I kind of learned my English was one from Louisiana, kind of Cajun guy, and another one from Utica, New York, who was Peace Corps volunteer. So it's like 2 different. And I thought about, okay, you have a Northern English and Southern English. Then we came to Alabama. It's like, oh, it's still a bit different.
Yeah, I would say that you learned 2 different languages of English. Like those are 2 different variations. That's a whole different conversation. That is awesome. Well, I would say kudos. Your English is awesome. And so you guys get married, you move to the States for a time. And what was life like in those early days of being married here?
Yeah, so in 2011, we got married, did the fiance visa process, that show 90 Day Fiance, like that post dated our marriage. Otherwise, I'm sure we would have applied.
Except the less drama.
Yeah, not that much drama. We definitely were getting married. So 2011, we got married and we were waiting for his paperwork, just different processes. And we actually, that December of 2011, went back to Ukraine, lived in Lugansk, which is his hometown. We were working with the church there. And then by the time our first anniversary came around in 2012, I was pregnant with our first child, and it was time to do the next step in his paperwork. And we thought, we really need to go to the States for a period of time to get this done, thinking it would be 2 or 3 years, and then that we would go back to Ukraine. So first son is born. We moved down to Foley. I was from Birmingham, but Foley's like Orange Beach, Baldwin County on our little niche of paradise in Alabama. And so we moved here. Our son turns 1, and then the war breaks out in Ukraine, which is, I don't want to say it was shocking. It was shocking at the time, just like this has been. But the war didn't start February 24th, 2022. It started 8 years before that. And it started in Yuriy's hometown. So his family, they were displaced, like missile shrapnel hitting the roof, 1 million plus Ukrainians displaced internally when that war started. And we really quickly realized we would not be able to go back to that area of Ukraine, which had been the plan. Yeah. So for that period of years from 2013 until 2017, we felt really stuck. Like, Lord, what are you doing? But in the meantime, we wanted to go back, but the war was so uncertain. We didn't qualify to go with certain missions agencies just based on his paperwork. He wasn't a citizen. And so anyway, we're like, okay, what are we doing? And we decided a couple months after my son turned 1 that we wanted to do foster care. We had heard about the call to foster care at our church in Birmingham. Knew the same need existed down here. And so we joined those classes, which we really enjoyed, the 12-week classes that you go through. And one of the speakers on panel night, which is like the last kind of, night of meetings, mentioned these videos with Dr. Karen Purvis in them. And at that time, like, they weren't even available to buy online. You had to rent them, like check out the DVDs through the library of the Children's Aid Society. Yep.
They're shipping you with this.
So the shipping with a little zipper bag. So we were like, well, we need those. We don't know what we're doing. So we sat in bed and watched all those DVDs like night after night after night. And because of that, it changed how we parented every child that came into our home, biological or in the foster care system. And we were open to adoption, but we never had a placement where we considered adoption. It was not feasible, either birth order. We desired to keep birth order in our family based on my experience growing up. And so we spent 5 years working in the foster care system in Baldwin County. We served as foster parents for 3 years. We did not have a lot of long placements. I had 2 more kids during that time, and we closed our home, but then I got trained as a co-leader, and I was able to lead 2 groups of parent classes with the social worker at DHR. And so that was a huge privilege. And I really found my passion for teaching trauma-informed topics and things like that from that adventure. So.
Okay, so Yuri, I want to ask you a question. You're watching these Karen Purvis videos, and you guys are walking through that journey of foster care here. Are you, as you're learning all of that about the brain and about trauma and parenting and different approaches and all that, are you thinking about what's happening in Ukraine at that point and thinking about like the need for this content to get there or for you guys to do work there? Was that crossing your mind at all?
I think when we watched, we not thought about, okay, we need to immediately, translate or something like that. We were more like kind of doggy paddling ourselves, trying to figure out, okay, how can we implement for ourselves in our life? And then eventually we start thinking about, okay, how can we give, some practical tools to our friends or our partners in Ukraine. So that's kind of like where our journey was. Not like a teaching, more like, hey, if you have this, you can use this, and it's probably will be much better. And they'll be like, oh, because it's kind of hard when you coming up. It's like, hey, listen to me. I'm from America. Right. I'll tell you everything. So,
I think we both reflected on areas where we had served in Ukraine. When we met, it was at that Passion Conference, but actually the whole summer we were together. We were serving at a camp that served children in at-risk situations, like low income from villages, and kids who were being raised in orphanages, which if people are not aware, the system in Ukraine is orphanage boarding schools, and about 70 to 80% of the kids that are in the orphanage boarding schools, even full-time, are not true orphans, meaning they still have families who have parental rights.
Or one of the parents.
Or one parent or one relative. Some of them legitimately cannot take care of their children. It's an 80-year-old grandmother who absolutely cannot care for these kids well. But some of them are actually, the government workers recruit families to bring their children there because it keeps the orphanage open, keeps the school open, and keeps all those employees there. And for the parents, they get a little taste of freedom because the offer is send your kid to school in this next village and they can come home on the weekends. And they get that taste of freedom of actually not having to parent their children. And I'm not trying to knock them. They're in a hard situation themselves. And a lot of those parents grew up in the orphanage boarding school system, and they think, well, I'm okay. So it's okay if my kids, and so the attachment just starts to absolutely dissolve from that school age. And so when you hear the numbers of orphans in Ukraine, you have to make a distinction between those who truly don't have parental rights or living relatives and those who are simply growing up in an institution by choice, by their parents' choice. So where I started with that was we look back reflecting on our service at those camps and going, okay, we don't need to be hard on ourselves because we didn't know what we didn't know now, what we know now. Right. But how can we do better if we end up going back, if we end up on short-term teams, even if we're advising teams that go, how can we do better? And that really was the catalyst for a lot of what we did, in our 4 years in Ukraine.
Okay. So not long after that, you guys arrived back in Ukraine, and Yuriy, would you give us as much as you can, just the brief background. So I would guess a lot of people don't know that the war did not start in 2022 when we saw it explode on social media, but it had been brewing. It had been brewing for generations, right? And then there would be small conflicts on the way. And 8 years ago is when the war started. Would you kind of give the brief overview of here's what's happening over there? This is why this started for people who have not, known what's going on.
So, basically, we have a southeast part of Ukraine, the more like a Russian-speaking area, because part of the Soviet Union just been in the last 70 years, plenty more people kind of come here, coal mining company, factories, and that central and western Ukraine, more like heavy, like a normal day Ukraine, like Russian, like Ukrainian-speaking. So when I was born, I was native speaker Russian. I went to school and I learned Ukrainian, and I kind of fell in love with Ukraine, and so 2014, what happened is after revolution, 2013, 14 was kind of boiling, and we pushed our president, who was kind of corrupt, and he was moving away from what people wanted, kind of to more to what Russia wanted. Yeah. Russia annexed Crimea, and everybody was kind of shocked, like, what we do in Ukraine? Didn't I expect that? And then they kind of start sponsoring these freedom fighters, I would say in quotes, in the East, saying like, hey, liberate yourself, kind of thing. So when war began, it was hard. It was like the soldiers were going. There was literally real battles, and so many people died. And then kind of they froze this conflict. They kind of drew the lines and said, we're going to do this. And for a while, people kind of found this weird normalcy, kind of normal life in mix with this mayhem. It's almost like, people start saying, oh, war is not here. War is like 100 miles away. And so people kind of learned to live with that. It was always a mess, but it's kind of like there. And a lot of people just run away. Like my parents abandoned their house, left everything, kind of moved to the Western Ukraine because, and my dad even said, like, I'll come back. And he came back a couple years ago. And I was like, man, it's just so dark. It's just so sad. And because basically it's like warlords ruling this area.
Okay. And to give people a geographical context, Ukraine is the size of Texas. And the area taken over at the beginning of the war is about the size of New Jersey, a little bit bigger. So this is a large chunk of the country that was taken over and made into what, from the Ukrainian perspective, false republics that were given opportunity to have Russian citizenship, Russian currency flowing there. So totally illegal, false voting to make this annexation happen of that third of the country plus the peninsula at the bottom.
Okay. And so in 2022, what was it that transpired to spark everything back up so quickly?
I think it's a great mystery for everybody because before, because we came to US right before the war, and everybody asking us because we moved to US in Ukraine 2018, and we did stay there for 4 years almost.
So we just to clarify, we were visiting our family on what missionaries call a furlough or a home assignment. It's when you come and you visit your family, supporting churches, and you touch base, maybe fundraise for a project. So we came in December 2021, planning to go back with our plane tickets on May 2nd, 2022. So this was a 4-month kind of time in the States for us. So we get here, people are asking us, what's going on? Russian troops are in Belarus, which is north of Ukraine. And we truly had no idea. We did not think anything was going to happen.
I thought Putin was just trying to convince the world, hey, be afraid of me, and I need something from you or whatever. Just, I don't know, this weird kind of muscle flexing thing.
Yeah.
But because even a lot of Russians do not expect that whole thing to fall apart. And so it was shock for us. It was truly shock. And even though, for example, give you an example, my sister used to live in the East. And her town is like one of the last frontiers of Ukraine. Okay. And when everything started happening on February 24th, I'm texting her. It's like, hey, on the news it's saying explosions. And I'm checking up with my people in Odessa, and they saying in our cities explosions too. It's like, what's happening in the East? And she was saying, well, it's usual. It's like you hear some explosions, but it's far away. It's all normal. And then 3 hours later, she said, okay, that's everything very, very bad. I need to get out. So even for her, who was on the border there, she would not expect completely.
Yeah. And so it just sort of took, I think when people think of war and see the images that are coming out, you think of this like alarm going off and crisis, and everyone has almost like a tornado alarm. Like you kind of see it coming and like, oh, we better get out of here. And what you're saying, it was much more of just a surprise of like, this is not normal. And it swept so quickly through.
And it comes to a point, like, no one knows how big that will be invasion. Because I'll give you an example. So she was in the East, and then she's like, I need to get out. And they happen on the taxi, drive like 10 miles to this train station, happen on the train, move to the Kharkiv. And Kharkiv had been heavy bombing. So she's like, okay, we cannot stay here because it's one of the biggest cities in the East. So okay, we need to go to Kyiv. They started going to Kyiv, and Kyiv bombing too. They're like, okay, we cannot stay here either. And she and her husband, 2 kids. So it's like they have a like 9-year-old, 10-year-old, and they have a 13-year-old. So then they move into the to the western part because it was mayhem. Kind of people did not know, even people who were making moves. Okay, I need to run away. Did not know what to, because you go in and the cell service is patchy, and there are a lot of misinformation was flowing everywhere.
Man, wow. So you guys are stateside and seeing this happen, and what are the things that you were working on? I mean, if you want to share about the War Fund, you can. Like, what were the things you guys were working on during the days here to be connected and support over there?
So those first few days and weeks were absolute chaos. We were terrible connected parents. I mean, like every notch you would want to hit as an attached parent, we were just not hitting those at all. Right. So we're grateful for grace from God and from our kids. We were on our phones a lot because we're just checking with people, asking, do you need anything? Connecting different people, this person to this person. I start sharing in my Instagram stories because I'm getting news from Ukrainian channels on an app called Telegram. Yeah. And I'm saving those photos and videos, translating them, and then putting them out there because the American news media, actually, I want to say it's been pretty good coverage. The first 6 months, especially, were excellent coverage on the news. They had live reporters there. I mean, but that you're just getting that one side of it. So I'm getting the Ukrainian side, sharing that. And pretty quickly we realized we need a way to send money to Ukraine. And we just had never really needed to send money to someone. We could always send it to ourselves from our American account, or someone could send it through PayPal, right? So it was very difficult. So I sat on my computer for hours those first few days trying to figure out, how do I send money to my friend who needs money for gas to get out? Like it was really complicated. Right. Slowly, different things, Western Union started to open up, and we are with an organization called Globe International, which is a nonprofit sending agency for missionaries. And so we called Globe and said, hey, we need a separate account that's going to be a fund that if people want to donate money, they can donate it, and we're going to get it to our partners. And so our ministry in Ukraine for 4 years was focused on, I would just say, vulnerable populations. So Yuriy was working with our partners, a Ukrainian nonprofit called Heritage Ukraine, and mentoring teenage boys from single parent homes, where absent fathers or fathers who are working overseas. We were working with the deaf community, which is an underserved population everywhere in the world. We were working with families with kids with special needs. I was working with the moms of those children. So we wanted to be committed to supporting those partners and groups of people and helping them, evacuate or get food or whatever they needed. I told my dad that first day, like, man, if we could raise like $10,000, that would be amazing. I mean, God blew our expectations out of the water. So it's far surpassed $50,000 within a couple of weeks, but we've dispersed almost 80% of the money that we've raised because the needs continue. And so we feel really blessed that that's our work, advocacy for Ukraine, fundraising to send those funds to the people on the ground that they may not be getting help from these big organizations or governments. We're really trying to get it to people who we know and trust and know that they need it.
Yeah. So for people who are fleeing, let's think of like your family, for example. You were talking about with a 13-year-old and a 9-year-old, 10-year-old, like they're on a train trying to get somewhere. Where are there places that most families are trying to get to? And now that, we're pretty aware of what is happening with the war, are there places that are known safe havens that families are trying to get to if they're needing to flee?
So I think a lot of, because in the first 24 hours of the war, Ukraine kind of have an open border. If you want to leave, you can leave. And after these 24 hours, Ukraine pretty quickly figure out, okay, we need to keep some manpower. So they forbid every male from 18 to 60 years old to leave Ukraine. So you cannot leave. So then a lot of families come to the point of, if you want to leave Ukraine, you need to leave by yourself. Okay, female with my kids. My husband gonna stay behind. And we had no couple families and our friends who did that. They thought, their husband said, like, you go, you be safe. I'll figure out life here. Yeah. And now it's almost a year they've been split up that way. And they're like, no, they're visiting on the border, kind of like that, because he cannot leave. Some people decide, okay, we're gonna stay, but we're gonna stay in the western parts, and they're like renting apartments, renting kind of like houses together or something like that. So,
and the first wave of people that came out of Ukraine were people that had connections or means, or they already had a biometric passport so they could get into a Schengen country with no problem. If you didn't have that, it was going to be problematic. It's easier to relocate to the West, or even people from the East relocate to Odessa, which is where we lived. And it's the big port city on the Black Sea. So even though it's not necessarily safe in Odessa, that's safer than where it was, coming from in the East. So families are being separated. This war will have detrimental impacts. There's not been a single generation of Ukrainians where the men have not been touched by war in 100 years. So you can imagine the impact that has had on family structure, on trauma, on attachment, on the absence of fathers, or presence of fathers struggling with alcoholism, or it's tough. It's really tough. It was tough before the war, and now their families just being absolutely torn apart. We have a couple that we worked with last year, 19 years old. They got married last October, and he was killed a couple months ago. Mm-hmm. And now she's a 19-year-old widow trying to figure out how to start her life over again. And they didn't even have kids. And she's even said that. I'm actually glad we didn't have kids yet, because I can't imagine trying to raise, and that's happening to our other friends. Yeah. So we're acutely aware of, based on their stories, how traumatic, truly traumatic and devastating this is.
That's all for episode 1. You've been listening to War and Resilience, How Ukrainians Are Teaching the World, a production of Empower to Connect Media.